Hey guys, tonight we descend into the grimy, unwashed, and absolutely revolting world of Viking hygiene, where soap was a luxury, baths were a distant memory, and personal cleanliness was apparently optional. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Picture this. You're walking through a Viking settlement on a crisp morning in 9th century Scandinavia. The first thing that hits you isn't the sight of longships or the sound of hammering from the blacksmith's forge. It's the smell. A thick, choking wall of human odor so intense it could knock a charging bear unconscious. Welcome to Viking hygiene, or rather, the complete and utter absence of it. Now, before we dive headfirst into this cesspool of medieval filth, let me paint you a picture of just how spectacularly wrong our modern romanticized view of Vikings really is. Hollywood wants you to believe these were noble warriors with flowing clean hair and perfectly maintained beards, sailing majestically across pristine fjords. The reality: they were walking biological weapons, so pungent that enemy armies could literally smell them coming from miles away. Tonight, we're going to explore the absolutely horrifying truth about Viking personal hygiene, or lack thereof. We'll uncover why these seafaring raiders made medieval peasants look like modern germaphobes, discover the shocking things they used instead of soap, and reveal how their legendary raids might have succeeded purely because their enemies couldn't get close enough to fight them without passing out from the stench. But here's what makes this story even more fascinating. The Vikings weren't just dirty by accident. Their entire culture, their daily routines, their very survival depended on practices that would make a modern health inspector weep openly. This isn't just about people who didn't bathe enough. This is about a civilization that turned poor hygiene into an art form, a lifestyle, and possibly even a weapon of war. So settle in, because what you're about to hear will forever change how you think about those legendary Norse warriors. And trust me, after tonight, you'll never complain about your roommate's hygiene habits again. Let's start with the most basic question. How often did Vikings actually bathe? The answer will shock you, and not in a good way. While most medieval Europeans managed a bath maybe once a month, Vikings took this to an entirely new level of neglect. Archaeological evidence suggests that the average Viking might go 6 months or more without a proper wash. 6 months. Let that sink in for a moment. But it gets worse. When they did attempt to clean themselves, it wasn't what you'd call bathing in any recognizable sense. Vikings lived in a world where hot water was a precious commodity, soap was virtually unknown, and privacy was non-existent. Their idea of getting clean involved splashing some cold river water on themselves, maybe rubbing off the worst of the grime with their bare hands, and calling it a day. The wealthy Vikings, the jarls, and successful raiders had access to something resembling a bathhouse. But even these weren't the luxurious affairs you might imagine. Picture a smoky wooden hut filled with steam, where multiple unwashed bodies would crowd together in water that was reused until it resembled thick, brown soup. The water wasn't changed between users. Everyone just climbed into the same increasingly filthy liquid, adding their own special blend of sweat, dirt, and bodily fluids to the communal stew. And here's the kicker. This communal bathing wasn't about cleanliness. It was a social event. Vikings would gather in these steamy hovels to gossip, make deals, and bond over their mutual filthiness. Imagine trying to conduct business while marinating in other people's bodily secretions. It's no wonder Viking negotiations were often settled with axes rather than handshakes. The common Vikings, the farmers and craftsmen, didn't even have access to these dubious bathing facilities. They made do with whatever water source was available, which in the harsh Scandinavian climate meant ice-cold streams and lakes for most of the year. Taking a bath in freezing water isn't just unpleasant, it's potentially deadly, so most Vikings simply chose not to risk it. Instead, they developed what can generously be called alternative cleaning methods. They would scrape dirt off their skin with crude tools, rub themselves down with coarse fabrics, and in desperate times, even use snow as a makeshift cleanser. None of these methods were particularly effective, and all of them left Vikings looking and smelling like they'd been buried underground for several weeks. But the real horror show began with their hair. Vikings are famous for their elaborate braids and supposedly magnificent beards, but the reality was far less glamorous. Without regular washing, Viking hair became a greasy, matted nightmare that harbored everything from lice to bits of rotting food. The longer the hair, the more disgusting it became. Viking women, despite having slightly better access to grooming tools, weren't much better off. They would try to maintain their long hair using primitive combs made from bone or wood. But without proper cleaning, these efforts were largely cosmetic. The hair might be arranged in intricate patterns, but it was still fundamentally filthy. And those famous Viking beards, they were less symbols of masculine prowess and more like portable ecosystems. Food scraps, drink, spit, and worse would accumulate in the tangled mess of facial hair. Some Viking beards were so encrusted with grime that they probably qualified as archaeological sites in their own right. The Vikings did have one tool that they prized above almost all others when it came to personal grooming: the comb. Archaeological digs have uncovered hundreds of Viking combs, and they're often found in places of honor, buried with their owners or displayed prominently in homes. But here's the thing about Viking combs. They weren't used for styling. They were used for pest control. Lice were such a constant problem in Viking society that having a good comb was literally a matter of survival. Vikings would spend hours each day picking lice and other parasites out of their hair and beards. It was a losing battle, but they kept fighting it with the grim determination that made them legendary raiders. The combs themselves were often works of art, carved from antler or bone with intricate designs. But their beauty couldn't disguise their primary function as weapons in humanity's ancient war against tiny blood-sucking invaders. And the Vikings were losing that war badly. Even more disturbing was their approach to dental hygiene. Vikings had teeth, obviously, but maintaining them was apparently optional. Without toothbrushes, toothpaste, or any understanding of dental care, Viking mouths were horrifying caverns of decay and infection. They would occasionally clean their teeth by chewing on twigs or scraping them with small knives, but these methods were crude and often did more harm than good. The typical Viking's breath could probably kill small animals at close range, and their smiles revealed rows of blackened, broken teeth that looked like a graveyard after an earthquake. But the Vikings weren't entirely without vanity. They cared deeply about their appearance, just not in ways that involved being clean. They would dye their hair and beards with various concoctions, paint their faces for battle, and wear elaborate jewelry and clothing. They wanted to look fierce and impressive, but apparently smelling like a decomposing whale was part of the aesthetic. This brings us to one of the most puzzling aspects of Viking culture. They were incredibly skilled craftsmen and artists, capable of creating beautiful jewelry, intricate carvings, and sophisticated ships. They had the intelligence and dexterity to master complex technologies. But somehow, the concept of basic hygiene completely escaped them. Part of the problem was environmental. Scandinavia in the Viking Age was cold, harsh, and unforgiving. Hot water was a luxury that required time, fuel, and effort that were often needed for survival. When you're struggling to find enough food to make it through winter, heating water for a bath seems like an indulgent waste of resources. But it wasn't just practical considerations that kept Vikings dirty. Their culture actually seemed to embrace filthiness as a sign of hardiness and strength. A warrior covered in the grime of battle was more respected than one who appeared too clean. Cleanliness was associated with weakness, vanity, and foreign influence. This attitude extended to their clothing as well. Vikings wore the same garments for months without washing them, until the fabric was so saturated with sweat, grease, and dirt that it probably stood up on its own. When clothes finally became too disgusting, even for Viking standards, they weren't washed. They were simply discarded and replaced if replacement was available. The wealthy Vikings had multiple sets of clothing, but even they rarely bothered to clean them properly. Washing clothes was a labor-intensive process that involved hauling water, heating it, and spending hours scrubbing. Most Vikings couldn't be bothered with such mundane tasks when there were raids to plan and enemies to fight. So their clothing became like wearable museums of filth, documenting every meal, every battle, and every bodily function in permanent stains and odors. Archaeological analysis of Viking clothing fragments reveals layers of organic matter that tell the story of lives lived without any concept of laundering. The result was a society where everyone stank, but since everyone stank equally, nobody really noticed. It was like living in a world where color blindness was universal, except instead of not seeing colors, they couldn't smell their own horrific odors. But perhaps the most shocking aspect of Viking hygiene wasn't what they didn't do, but what they did do instead of proper cleaning. Vikings developed an entire arsenal of alternative hygiene practices that were somehow even worse than just staying dirty. For instance, they would sometimes try to mask their body odor using various natural substances. They would rub themselves with animal fat, which they believed would provide a protective layer against the elements. In reality, this just created a sticky surface that trapped even more dirt and bacteria. They also used various herbs and plants as primitive deodorants, crushing them up and rubbing them on their bodies. While some of these plants might have had mild antiseptic properties, they were no match for months of accumulated filth. The result was a nauseating combination of rotting vegetation and human musk that was probably worse than the original problem. Some Vikings would even cover themselves in mud or clay, believing it had cleansing properties. This practice might have originated from observing animals that wallow in mud to protect themselves from insects, but humans aren't built for that kind of treatment. The mud would dry and crack, taking some surface dirt with it, but leaving behind a residue that was even harder to remove than the original grime. The truly desperate would resort to bloodletting as a form of purification, believing that removing bad blood would somehow cleanse their entire system. This medieval medical practice was dangerous enough when performed by trained physicians, but Vikings would often do it themselves, with whatever sharp objects were handy. The result was infection, scarring, and absolutely no improvement in personal hygiene. but perhaps the most bizarre Viking cleaning ritual involved urine. Yes, you read that correctly. Vikings believed that human urine had cleansing and medicinal properties, and they would sometimes wash their hair and faces with it. The ammonia in aged urine does have some antibacterial properties, but the psychological and social costs of this practice were probably higher than any potential benefits. They would collect urine in special vessels and let it age for days or weeks before using it as a primitive shampoo. Imagine the smell of a Viking warrior who had just washed his hair in fermented piss. It's a wonder they could sneak up on anyone when their personal hygiene routine could be detected from several villages away. This primitive urine therapy wasn't limited to hair care. Vikings would also use it to treat wounds, believing it would prevent infection. In some cases, they weren't entirely wrong. The ammonia could kill certain bacteria, but it also introduced a host of other problems. Wounds treated with urine often became more infected than they would have been if left alone, leading to gangrene, sepsis, and death. The Vikings also had a peculiar relationship with animal products when it came to hygiene. They would use rendered animal fat not just as a protective coating, but as a primitive soap substitute. They would take the fat from seals, whales, or whatever animals they could hunt, melt it down, and smear it all over their bodies. This practice created a waxy coating that was supposed to repel water and provide insulation against the cold. But fat doesn't actually clean anything. It just creates another layer of grime that traps dirt, dead skin cells, and bacteria. Vikings coated in animal fat looked like they'd been dipped in grease, and they smelled even worse. The fat would go rancid within days, creating a putrid aroma that combined the worst aspects of rotting meat and unwashed human bodies. Vikings who used this method regularly developed a distinctive yellowish tint to their skin and a smell so powerful it could make hardened warriors vomit. But they didn't stop there. Vikings would also use various animal byproducts in their grooming routines. They would rub crushed fish bones on their teeth, believing it would keep them strong. They would use bird droppings as a primitive face cream, thinking it would protect their skin from windburn. They would even collect earwax from their livestock and use it as a hair pomade. None of these practices had any basis in reality, but Vikings clung to them with the same fervor they brought to their raids. They developed an entire mythology around these bizarre hygiene rituals, passing them down through generations like sacred traditions. The result was a culture where the most basic aspects of human cleanliness were not just ignored, but actively perverted into something even more disgusting. Vikings didn't just fail to wash themselves. They actively made themselves dirtier through their misguided attempts at hygiene. This brings us to one of the most horrifying aspects of Viking society: their living conditions. Vikings lived in longhouses, communal structures that housed extended families, servants, and sometimes even livestock. These buildings were designed for warmth and protection, not sanitation. A typical longhouse might contain 30 or 40 people, all living in close quarters without any concept of personal space or privacy. There were no separate rooms, no private bathrooms, and certainly no ventilation systems. Everyone ate, slept, worked, and performed bodily functions in the same cramped space. The smell inside a Viking longhouse defies description. Imagine the concentrated odor of dozens of unwashed bodies, combined with rotting food scraps, animal waste, and the smoke from constantly burning fires. The air was so thick with stench that newcomers would often pass out from the assault on their senses. Vikings didn't just tolerate these conditions, they seemed to thrive in them. Children were born and raised in this environment, developing immune systems that were either incredibly robust or completely overwhelmed. The mortality rate in Viking settlements was astronomical, particularly among infants and the elderly who couldn't adapt to the toxic living conditions. The floors of longhouses were typically covered with rushes or straw that was supposed to absorb spills and provide insulation. But these materials were rarely changed, sometimes going years without being replaced. They became saturated with every imaginable form of organic waste, creating a spongy carpet of decomposition that squelched underfoot. Vikings would throw food scraps, vomit, urine, and worse, directly onto these floors, where it would slowly rot and ferment. The rushes became breeding grounds for insects, rodents, and diseases that would spread rapidly through the confined population. But perhaps most disturbing of all was how Vikings dealt with human waste. They didn't have toilets, sewage systems, or even basic latrines. When nature called, Vikings would simply find the nearest corner of the longhouse and relieve themselves on the spot. The waste would be covered with more rushes or straw, but it never really went away. It just accumulated in layers, like geological strata of human excrement. Archaeological excavations of Viking settlements have revealed these waste layers, providing a horrifying record of centuries of poor sanitation. The smell of a Viking settlement could be detected from miles away, particularly in summer when the heat would intensify the odors. Travelers approaching Viking territories would often turn back rather than endure the assault on their senses. Some historical accounts describe Viking settlements as places where the very air seemed poisonous. Yet Vikings didn't seem to notice or care about these conditions. They had adapted to their environment so completely that they were essentially immune to their own stench. Visitors from other cultures would describe Vikings as people who had lost the ability to smell, though this was probably more psychological than physical. This adaptation to filth had profound effects on Viking society. It created a culture where disgust was almost unknown, where the most revolting practices were accepted as normal. Vikings would eat food that had been contaminated with waste, drink water that was obviously polluted, and sleep on bedding that was more ecosystem than furniture. The psychological effects of living in such conditions were probably significant, though difficult to measure from historical distance. Some scholars believe that the Vikings' legendary aggression and violence might have been partly caused by the constant stress of living in such unhealthy environments. The high levels of parasites, bacteria, and toxins in their systems could have affected their mental state, making them more irritable, paranoid, and prone to sudden outbursts of rage. The famous Viking berserkers, warriors who fought in drug-induced frenzies, might have been suffering from infections or poisoning rather than consuming psychoactive substances. But Vikings didn't just live in filth. They carried it with them wherever they went. When Viking raiders set out on their legendary expeditions, they brought their hygiene habits along for the journey. Viking longships were floating petri dishes of disease and contamination. These ships were marvels of engineering, capable of crossing vast oceans and navigating shallow rivers. But they were also cramped, poorly ventilated vessels where dozens of unwashed warriors would spend weeks or months in close quarters. The smell inside a Viking longship must have been beyond human endurance. Vikings would relieve themselves over the side of the ship, but in rough weather or during long ocean crossings, this wasn't always possible. They would use buckets or simply soil themselves where they sat. The wooden planks of the ship would become saturated with waste, creating a permanent stench that no amount of scrubbing could remove. Food and fresh water were precious commodities on these voyages, but Vikings would often contaminate their supplies through poor handling and storage. They would eat with unwashed hands, drink from contaminated containers, and store food in areas that had been used as toilets. The result was that Viking expeditions were often decimated by disease before they ever reached their targets. Dysentery, food poisoning, and various infections would sweep through the crews, leaving ships full of sick and dying warriors. Some Viking raids probably failed not because of enemy resistance, but because the raiders were too ill to fight. Yet when they did reach their destinations, Vikings had an unexpected advantage. Their legendary ferocity in battle might have been enhanced by their absolutely revolting personal hygiene. Enemy warriors who came close enough to engage Vikings in hand-to-hand combat would be overwhelmed by the stench, giving the Vikings crucial seconds of advantage. Some historical accounts describe Viking warriors as literally nauseating to fight against. The combination of fear and physical revulsion would cause enemy soldiers to hesitate, stumble, or even flee, rather than engage at close quarters. Vikings might have been the first warriors in history to weaponize their own body odor. This biological warfare wasn't intentional, but it was remarkably effective. Vikings could clear battlefields simply by showing up, their smell announcing their presence long before they came into view. Enemy armies would sometimes retreat without fighting, claiming that the Vikings were protected by evil spirits that made the air itself poisonous. But the most shocking aspect of Viking hygiene wasn't their daily habits or living conditions. It was how they dealt with death and disease. When Vikings died, which happened frequently due to their unhealthy lifestyle, their bodies were often left to rot for days or weeks before disposal. Viking funeral practices varied, but many involved burning the deceased on funeral pyres. This might seem like a hygienic practice, but Vikings would often hold elaborate feasts and celebrations around these burning corpses. They would eat, drink, and carouse while inhaling the smoke from burning human flesh. The ashes from these funeral pyres weren't carefully disposed of either. They would be scattered by the wind, contaminating water sources and food supplies. Vikings would sometimes even eat food that had been cooked over fires fueled by human remains, though whether this was intentional or accidental is unclear. When disease struck Viking communities, which it did regularly, their response was to double down on their unhygienic practices. They believed that illness was caused by evil spirits or curses, not by poor sanitation or contamination. Their treatments often involved rituals that made the problems worse. Sick Vikings would be treated with concoctions made from rotting plants, animal waste, and human bodily fluids. They would be bled with dirty knives, covered in infected poultices, and forced to consume substances that would make a modern toxicologist weep. The mortality rate from these treatments was probably higher than from the original diseases. But Vikings had their own twisted logic for these practices. They believed that by embracing filth and decay, they were proving their toughness and connection to the natural world. Clean people were seen as weak, pampered, and disconnected from the harsh realities of life. A Viking who smelled like roses would have been laughed out of the settlement, assuming anyone could get close enough to smell the roses over the underlying stench of decomposition. This philosophy extended to their concept of medicine and healing. Vikings believed that the body needed to be in harmony with its environment, and since their environment was filthy, they reasoned that their bodies should be equally contaminated. They would deliberately expose wounds to dirt and bacteria, thinking it would toughen the skin and prevent future injuries. When Vikings suffered cuts or battle wounds, they would pack them with whatever organic matter was handy: mud, manure, rotting vegetation, even maggots. While modern medicine has discovered that certain types of maggots can actually help clean infected wounds, Vikings weren't using medical-grade larvae. They were using whatever worms and insects they could find crawling around their filthy living spaces. The results were predictably horrific. Viking warriors would often die not from their battle wounds, but from the infections caused by their primitive treatment methods. Gangrene was so common that Vikings had dozens of different words to describe the various stages of flesh rot. They treated these conditions not as medical emergencies, but as natural parts of the warrior lifestyle. Even more disturbing was their approach to food preparation and storage. Vikings had no understanding of food safety or contamination. They would butcher animals with the same knives they used for personal grooming, spreading bacteria and parasites from their bodies directly into their food supply. Meat was often stored in the same areas where Vikings relieved themselves, creating a perfect environment for the growth of dangerous bacteria. They would hang fish and game in their longhouses, where the meat would slowly rot while being exposed to human waste, smoke, and the breath of dozens of unwashed inhabitants. Vikings would eat this contaminated meat without cooking it thoroughly, if they cooked it at all. Raw or undercooked meat was considered a delicacy, particularly fish that had been allowed to ferment in its own juices for weeks. The smell of Viking cuisine was reportedly so awful that even starving people would refuse to eat it. But perhaps the most revolting aspect of Viking food culture was their drinking habits. Vikings consumed vast quantities of mead, ale, and other fermented beverages, but they prepared these drinks using methods that would horrify modern brewers. They would ferment honey and grains in containers that had never been properly cleaned, using water that was obviously contaminated. The fermentation process would take place in wooden barrels or clay pots that had been used for storing human waste, dead animals, and various other organic matter. Vikings would simply dump out the previous contents and fill the containers with their brewing ingredients, adding layers of contamination to every batch. The resulting beverages were more like liquid compost than anything resembling modern alcohol. They were thick, chunky, and filled with floating debris that Vikings would simply strain through their teeth while drinking. The alcohol content was often high enough to kill some bacteria, but it also preserved other forms of contamination indefinitely. Vikings would share drinking vessels without any thought to hygiene, passing cups and horns from mouth to mouth throughout their communities. These containers were never washed, just rinsed with whatever liquid was handy, often urine or contaminated water. The rim of a Viking drinking horn was essentially a petri dish of every disease present in the settlement. But they didn't just share drinks. Vikings had a communal approach to almost everything, including personal hygiene tools. The few combs, knives, and other grooming implements in a settlement would be passed around freely, spreading lice, infections, and skin diseases from person to person. Viking children grew up in this environment, learning to accept filth as a natural part of life. They would play in the waste-covered floors of longhouses, eat contaminated food with their bare hands, and sleep in bedding that was more alive with parasites than the forest outside. The mortality rate among Viking children was staggering, with most dying before reaching adulthood. Those who survived developed immune systems that were either incredibly robust or completely compromised. Many Viking adults suffered from chronic illnesses, infections, and parasitic infestations that they simply accepted as normal parts of existence. But Vikings didn't see their high mortality rates as a problem to be solved. They viewed death as an inevitable part of life, and they believed that dying young in battle was preferable to growing old and weak. This philosophy conveniently ignored the fact that most Vikings died not from glorious combat, but from preventable diseases caused by their own filthy habits. Their burial practices reflected this casual attitude toward death and disease. When Vikings died, their bodies were often left lying around for days, while the community decided what to do with them. In winter, corpses might be stored in the longhouse alongside the living inhabitants, slowly decomposing and spreading disease. Vikings would sometimes eat meals while sitting next to rotting corpses, apparently unbothered by the smell or the health implications. They believed that the spirits of the dead needed time to prepare for their journey to the afterlife, and disturbing the body too quickly might anger these spirits. When they finally did dispose of the dead, Vikings would often bury them in shallow graves near their living areas, contaminating groundwater and soil. They would sometimes even bury corpses inside their longhouses, creating permanent sources of contamination that would affect generations of inhabitants. The few Vikings who lived long enough to reach old age were walking museums of disease and decay. They would be covered in scars, missing limbs, and suffering from chronic infections that had been festering for decades. Their teeth would be completely rotted away. Their hair would be falling out in clumps, and their skin would be covered in lesions and sores. Yet these elderly Vikings were revered as wise elders, their survival seen as proof of their strength and cunning rather than dumb luck. They would pass down their knowledge of hygiene practices to younger generations, ensuring that the cycle of filth would continue indefinitely. Viking women, despite being responsible for most domestic tasks, weren't any cleaner than their male counterparts. They would prepare food with unwashed hands, tend to sick family members without any protective measures, and care for infants in environments that would kill modern babies within hours. Viking mothers would often lose multiple children to preventable diseases, but they attributed these deaths to fate or the will of the gods rather than poor sanitation. They would continue using the same contaminated tools and methods that had killed their previous children, seeing no connection between their practices and the mortality rates. The clothing worn by Viking women was particularly revolting, as they were responsible for spinning, weaving, and maintaining textiles for their entire families. They would work with raw materials that had never been properly cleaned, using tools that were contaminated with every imaginable form of organic matter. Viking textiles were often made from wool that still contained bits of the animal it came from, including parasites, dirt, and bodily fluids. The spinning and weaving process would spread these contaminants throughout the fabric, creating clothing that was essentially wearable disease vectors. Women would wear the same undergarments for months without changing them, until the fabric literally disintegrated from the accumulation of sweat, blood, and other bodily secretions. When they did change clothes, the old garments would simply be thrown onto the floor of the longhouse, adding to the general accumulation of organic waste. Viking children learned these habits from birth, growing up in an environment where cleanliness was not just unknown, but actively discouraged. They would be taught that washing too frequently would make them weak and vulnerable to disease, the exact opposite of reality. Children would play games that involved rolling in mud, covering themselves with animal waste, and competing to see who could go longest without cleaning themselves. These activities were seen as healthy preparation for adulthood, building character and toughness. The educational system, such as it was, reinforced these attitudes. Viking children would learn practical skills like fighting, farming, and craftsmanship, but they would also learn that personal hygiene was a sign of weakness and foreign influence. Clean people were associated with their enemies, particularly the Christians, who were beginning to spread into Scandinavian territories. This cultural resistance to cleanliness became part of Viking identity, a way of distinguishing themselves from the civilizations they raided and conquered. They took pride in their filthiness, seeing it as evidence of their authentic connection to the natural world and their rejection of soft civilized values. But the most shocking aspect of Viking hygiene wasn't their ignorance of basic sanitation. It was their active resistance to cleanliness, even when they encountered cleaner cultures. When Vikings raided monasteries, towns, and cities with better hygiene practices, they didn't adopt these superior methods. Instead, they often destroyed bathing facilities, contaminated water sources, and forced their captives to live according to Viking standards. Vikings who settled in conquered territories would gradually contaminate their new environments, turning clean communities into replicas of their filthy homeland. They would fill wells with waste, convert bathhouses into stables, and introduce their livestock into living areas. The psychological impact of this deliberate filthiness on their enemies was significant. Many cultures viewed cleanliness as a sign of civilization and moral purity. By appearing as walking embodiments of decay and contamination, Vikings challenged the fundamental assumptions of the societies they encountered. Some historians believe that Viking raids were successful, not just because of their military skills, but because their appearance and smell created a kind of psychological warfare that demoralized their opponents. Who wants to fight an enemy that looks and smells like they've crawled out of a grave? This biological intimidation factor may have been one of the Vikings' greatest weapons, allowing relatively small raiding parties to conquer much larger settlements. The mere sight and smell of approaching Vikings was often enough to cause panic and flight among civilian populations, but this advantage came at a terrible cost. Viking society was constantly ravaged by diseases, infections, and parasitic infestations that would have been easily preventable with basic hygiene. Their life expectancy was among the lowest in medieval Europe, and their quality of life was abysmal by any reasonable standard. Yet Vikings persisted in their filthy ways for centuries, passing down their disgusting traditions from generation to generation with the same dedication they brought to their craftsmanship and warfare. They had turned poor hygiene into a cultural institution, a defining characteristic that set them apart from the rest of the world. The irony is that Vikings were capable of remarkable achievements in other areas. They were skilled navigators who reached North America centuries before Columbus. They were master craftsmen who created beautiful jewelry, weapons, and ships. They were poets and storytellers who preserved rich oral traditions. But when it came to basic human cleanliness, they were absolute disasters. This contradiction reveals something profound about human nature and cultural development. Intelligence, creativity, and technical skill don't automatically translate into wisdom about health and hygiene. Vikings could navigate by the stars and forge intricate metalwork, but they couldn't figure out that washing themselves might prevent disease. Their legacy in terms of hygiene is a cautionary tale about how cultural practices can become so entrenched that they persist even when they're obviously harmful. Vikings created a society where being clean was literally unthinkable, where the very concept of personal hygiene was seen as foreign and threatening. And perhaps most disturbing of all, they seemed to genuinely believe that their way of life was superior to the cleaner alternatives they encountered. Vikings weren't just dirty by necessity or ignorance. They were dirty by choice, by conviction, and by cultural pride. This makes their story not just a tale of poor hygiene, but a study in how humans can rationalize and celebrate practices that are clearly destructive. Vikings turned their filthiness into a virtue, their diseases into signs of strength, and their contamination into a badge of honor. They lived in their own waste, died from preventable diseases, and passed on their suffering to their children, all while believing they were living the only authentic and honorable way possible. It's a level of self-deception that would be admirable if it weren't so absolutely revolting. But the true horror of Viking hygiene becomes clear when we examine their approach to food and cooking. Modern food safety would have been an alien concept to these seafaring warriors who treated meal preparation like a biological warfare experiment gone horribly wrong. Picture a typical Viking kitchen, if you can call it that. There were no separate cooking areas, no clean surfaces, and certainly no understanding that raw meat and human waste probably shouldn't occupy the same space. Vikings would butcher animals on the same surfaces where they relieved themselves, using knives that hadn't been cleaned since the last full moon, assuming they remembered there was a last full moon. The concept of washing hands before handling food was not just unknown, it would have been considered suspicious. A Viking who spent time cleaning their hands before cooking would have been viewed with the same suspicion we might reserve for someone who insists on wearing a hazmat suit to check the mail. It simply wasn't done, and anyone who suggested it was probably influenced by those soft, weak Christians and their bizarre obsession with cleanliness. Vikings would prepare meals with the same hands they used to tend wounds, handle livestock, and perform various bodily functions. Cross-contamination wasn't a concern because the concept didn't exist. Everything was already contaminated anyway, so what difference did a little extra bacteria make? Their cooking methods were equally appalling. Vikings would often cook meat that had been sitting around for days or weeks, slowly rotting in the warm, humid environment of the longhouse. They had no refrigeration, obviously, but they also lacked proper preservation techniques. Meat would be hung from the rafters, where it would collect dust, insects, and whatever other organic matter happened to be floating through the smoky air. This hanging meat would develop a thick coating of mold and bacteria that Vikings actually considered desirable. They believed that meat needed to age properly before consumption, not understanding that what they were calling aging was actually advanced decomposition. The green, fuzzy coating on their meat wasn't seasoning. It was a thriving ecosystem of microorganisms that would have impressed modern microbiologists. When Vikings did cook this contaminated meat, they rarely cooked it thoroughly. They preferred their food rare or even raw, believing that overcooking would destroy the meat's strength-giving properties. The result was that Vikings were essentially consuming biological weapons disguised as dinner. Their cooking fires added another layer of contamination to an already horrifying situation. These fires burned constantly in the center of the longhouse, fed by whatever combustible material was available. This often included human and animal waste, rotting wood, and occasionally the bones of the recently deceased. The smoke from these fires would permeate everything in the longhouse, including the food being prepared. Vikings would cook their meals in pots and pans that were never properly cleaned. These cooking vessels would accumulate layers of burned food, grease, and various organic matter that created a permanent coating of contamination. Vikings considered this buildup beneficial, believing it added flavor and prevented food from sticking. In reality, it was a breeding ground for every disease-causing organism in Scandinavia. The water used for cooking was equally problematic. Vikings would collect water from whatever source was convenient without any concern for contamination. Rivers, ponds, and wells that were obviously polluted with human and animal waste were considered perfectly acceptable sources of cooking water. They would sometimes even use water that had been sitting stagnant in containers for weeks, developing a thick green film that Vikings would simply skim off before use. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Viking food preparation was their communal approach to cooking and eating. Multiple people would handle the same ingredients with their unwashed hands, stirring pots with utensils that had been used for various other purposes, including personal hygiene. The concept of individual portions or clean serving implements was foreign to Viking culture. When it came time to eat, Vikings would gather around communal bowls and pots, reaching in with their bare hands to grab whatever they wanted. There were no individual plates or utensils for most Vikings. Everyone would eat from the same containers, spreading whatever diseases and parasites they carried to the entire community. The ale and mead that accompanied these meals were prepared using equally unsanitary methods. Vikings would ferment their alcoholic beverages in containers that had previously held human waste, dead animals, and various other organic matter. The fermentation process would take place in environments that were already saturated with bacteria and parasites. These beverages were often thick and chunky, filled with floating debris that Vikings would consume along with the liquid. They believed that the chunks added nutritional value and proved the authenticity of the drink. Modern analysis of residue from Viking drinking vessels reveals a horrifying array of bacteria, parasites, and organic contaminants that would kill most people within hours of consumption. But Vikings had adapted to these conditions over generations, developing immune systems that were either incredibly robust or completely overwhelmed. Many Vikings suffered from chronic digestive problems, but they attributed these issues to curses or evil spirits rather than their appalling food safety practices. The preparation of dairy products was equally revolting. Vikings would milk their animals into containers that had never been properly cleaned, allowing the milk to ferment in environments that were already contaminated with every imaginable form of bacteria. The resulting cheese and butter were more like biological weapons than food products. Viking cheese was often so contaminated that it would move on its own, teeming with maggots and other parasites. Vikings considered this a sign of quality, believing that the more active the cheese, the more nutritious it must be. They would eat these writhing dairy products with enthusiasm, apparently unbothered by the fact that their food was literally crawling with life. The butter they produced was equally horrifying, often rancid and contaminated with various organic matter. Vikings would store this butter in containers made from animal stomachs, which added another layer of contamination to an already revolting product. The smell of Viking butter could reportedly knock a person unconscious at 20 paces. But Vikings didn't limit their culinary adventures to land-based foods. Their approach to seafood was equally appalling, if not worse. Vikings would catch fish and let it rot for weeks before consumption, believing that fermented fish was more nutritious and flavorful than fresh fish. The smell of Viking fish dishes was so intense that it could be detected from miles away. They would prepare a particularly revolting dish called surströmming, which involved allowing fish to ferment in its own juices for months. The resulting product was so putrid that even other Vikings would sometimes refuse to eat it. Modern attempts to recreate this dish have resulted in evacuated buildings and hazmat team responses. Vikings would also consume various marine animals that had washed up dead on beaches, regardless of how long they had been decomposing. They believed that the sea had blessed these animals by delivering them to shore, and it would be disrespectful to refuse such gifts. The fact that these animals were often diseased or poisoned apparently didn't factor into their decision-making process. Their approach to food storage was equally problematic. Vikings would keep leftover food in the same areas where they stored human waste, weapons, and dead animals. There was no separation between different types of materials, and everything would gradually become contaminated with everything else. Food would be stored in containers made from animal skins, stomachs, and intestines that had never been properly cleaned or preserved. These containers would slowly rot and decompose, adding their own special flavor to whatever was stored inside. Vikings apparently enjoyed this additional taste, believing it proved the authenticity of their storage methods. The concept of expiration dates or food spoilage was foreign to Viking culture. They would eat food that had been stored for months or even years, regardless of its condition. Food that was visibly moldy, crawling with insects, or emitting toxic gases was considered perfectly acceptable for consumption. Vikings would sometimes eat food that had been contaminated with human and animal waste, either accidentally or because they saw no reason to waste perfectly good food just because it had come into contact with excrement. Their attitude toward contamination was remarkably casual, treating it as an inevitable part of life rather than something to be avoided. This cavalier approach to food safety had predictable consequences. Vikings suffered from constant digestive problems, food poisoning, and parasitic infections. Many died from consuming contaminated food, but these deaths were attributed to fate or the displeasure of the gods, rather than poor food handling practices. The most shocking aspect of Viking food culture was their approach to cannibalism during times of extreme hardship. When food was scarce, Vikings would sometimes consume the bodies of their dead relatives, treating human flesh like any other meat product. They would prepare and cook human remains using the same unsanitary methods they applied to animal meat. These cannibalistic practices weren't considered taboo or morally problematic by Viking standards. They were simply practical responses to food shortages. Vikings would consume human flesh that had been rotting for days, apparently unbothered by the health implications or the emotional trauma of eating their own family members. But Vikings didn't limit their consumption of human remains to times of famine. Some Viking warriors would eat parts of their defeated enemies, believing it would transfer the strength and courage of the fallen to the consumer. These practices were often ritualistic, but they were performed using the same unsanitary methods that characterized all Viking food preparation. The psychological effects of these dietary practices on Viking society were probably significant. Consuming contaminated food, human remains, and various toxic substances likely affected their mental state, contributing to the erratic behavior and violence that characterized Viking culture. Modern medical analysis suggests that many Vikings probably suffered from chronic poisoning, parasitic infections, and nutritional deficiencies that would have affected their cognitive function and emotional stability. The famous Viking berserkers might have been suffering from food poisoning or parasitic infections rather than consuming psychoactive drugs. But Vikings seemed to take pride in their ability to consume foods that would kill or sicken people from other cultures. They viewed their iron stomachs as evidence of their superior toughness and adaptation to harsh conditions. A Viking who could eat rotten fish without getting sick was considered more worthy than one who required fresh, clean food. This attitude extended to their treatment of food-related illnesses. When Vikings became sick from consuming contaminated food, they would often consume even more of the same contaminated substances, believing it would build their resistance and cure their ailments. The concept that the food itself might be causing the illness was generally beyond their comprehension. Viking children were introduced to these dietary practices from birth, with mothers feeding contaminated food to infants and toddlers. The mortality rate among Viking children was partly due to these feeding practices, but survivors developed immune systems that were either incredibly robust or completely compromised. The few Vikings who lived to old age often suffered from chronic digestive problems, malnutrition, and various diseases related to their lifetime of consuming contaminated food. But these health problems were seen as natural parts of aging rather than consequences of poor dietary choices. Viking food culture was so revolting that it became a form of biological warfare against their enemies. When Vikings conquered new territories, they would often force their captives to eat Viking-prepared food, which would quickly sicken or kill people who weren't adapted to such extreme contamination. Some historical accounts describe Viking food as being so disgusting that starving prisoners would choose death rather than consume it. The mere smell of Viking cooking was reportedly enough to cause nausea and vomiting among people from cleaner cultures. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Viking food culture was how it reinforced their broader attitudes toward hygiene and health. By treating contaminated food as normal and desirable, Vikings created a culture where disease and suffering were seen as natural and inevitable parts of life. This acceptance of contamination extended to every aspect of Viking society, creating a feedback loop where poor hygiene practices were justified by their apparent success in producing tough, hardy people. The fact that most Vikings died young from preventable diseases was conveniently ignored in favor of celebrating the few survivors who managed to adapt to the toxic environment. The legacy of Viking food culture is a cautionary tale about how dietary practices can become so entrenched in a society that they persist even when they're obviously harmful. Vikings created a cuisine that was essentially designed to kill people, but they celebrated it as evidence of their cultural superiority and toughness. And while we might laugh at the absurdity of Viking food preparation today, it's worth remembering that these practices sustained a civilization for centuries. Vikings conquered vast territories, explored unknown oceans, and left a lasting impact on world history, all while consuming food that would be classified as hazardous waste by modern standards. Their story reminds us that human beings are remarkably adaptable creatures, capable of surviving in conditions that seem impossible. But it also shows us the terrible cost of that adaptation, the suffering and death that result when survival strategies become cultural traditions that resist change and improvement. The Vikings may have been legendary warriors and explorers, but when it came to food safety, they were absolute disasters. Their kitchens were biological warfare laboratories, their meals were toxic waste, and their dining practices were exercises in communal contamination. Yet somehow, they managed to thrive and terrorize medieval Europe, while eating food that would kill a modern person within hours. It's a testament to human resilience, cultural stubbornness, and the power of adaptation. But it's also a reminder that just because people can survive extreme conditions doesn't mean they should, and that some traditions are worth abandoning in favor of basic human health and dignity. The Vikings didn't just contaminate their food and living spaces. They turned the very act of trade and commerce into a biological hazard that would make modern health inspectors resign in horror. When Vikings engaged in trading expeditions, they brought with them not just goods and weapons, but entire ecosystems of disease and contamination that would spread across medieval Europe like a plague of filth. Picture a Viking trading post, if you can stomach it. These weren't the organized marketplaces of other medieval cultures, with designated areas for different goods and some semblance of sanitation. Viking trading posts were chaotic sprawls of contaminated merchandise, unwashed bodies and organic matter in various stages of decomposition. The smell alone was enough to drive away potential customers, which probably explains why Vikings often had to resort to raiding instead of peaceful commerce. Vikings would transport their goods in ships that doubled as floating toilets, storage areas for rotting food, and communal living spaces for dozens of unwashed crew members. By the time these vessels reached their destinations, the cargo had been thoroughly contaminated by months of exposure to human waste, spoiled provisions, and the concentrated body odor of men who considered bathing a sign of weakness. The furs and textiles that Vikings traded were particularly revolting. These goods would be prepared using methods that defied every principle of hygiene known to civilized cultures. Animal skins would be cured using urine, brain matter, and various other organic substances that created a permanent stench and guaranteed contamination. The process of turning raw hides into tradable goods involved Viking workers handling the materials with their filthy hands, often while suffering from open wounds and infections. Viking textiles were even worse, if such a thing were possible. The wool they traded came from animals that had never been properly cleaned, still containing parasites, dirt, and bodily fluids from the original sheep or goat. The spinning and weaving processes would spread these contaminants throughout the fabric, creating textiles that were essentially wearable disease vectors. When Vikings did manage to find buyers for their contaminated goods, the transaction itself became an exercise in biological warfare. Vikings would handle the merchandise with unwashed hands, breathing their toxic breath on potential customers and leaving traces of their various infections on everything they touched. Many trading relationships probably ended not because of price disputes, but because the buyers couldn't tolerate being in close proximity to Viking merchants. The amber and jewelry that Vikings traded were somewhat less susceptible to contamination, but even these items weren't safe from Viking hygiene habits. Vikings would often store precious goods in the same containers they used for human waste, or carry them in pouches made from untreated animal organs that would slowly rot and contaminate whatever was inside. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Viking commerce was their approach to slave trading. Vikings were notorious for capturing and selling human beings, but their treatment of these unfortunate captives was so appalling that many probably died before reaching market. Viking slave ships were floating concentration camps where prisoners were packed together in conditions that would make a modern prison seem luxurious. Slaves were fed the same contaminated food that Vikings consumed, but without the benefit of a lifetime of adaptation to such toxic conditions. Many captives would die from food poisoning, disease, or simple revulsion at being forced to consume Viking cuisine. Those who survived the journey would arrive at market already sick and weakened, reducing their value, but apparently not bothering the Viking traders who had caused their condition. Viking slave markets were themselves health hazards of the highest order. These temporary installations would spring up wherever Vikings could find buyers for their human cargo, usually in areas with minimal sanitation or organization. Slaves would be displayed in conditions that would horrify modern observers, chained together in groups where disease could spread rapidly through the captive population. The Vikings who ran these markets showed no concern for the health or welfare of their merchandise. Sick slaves were sold alongside healthy ones, often without any disclosure of their condition. Buyers who complained about purchasing diseased slaves were usually told that illness was the will of the gods and that a strong slave would recover quickly. But the contamination didn't stop with the slaves themselves. Viking traders would often sell the same chains, ropes, and restraints to multiple buyers without cleaning them between uses. These items would become repositories of every disease and infection that had afflicted previous captives, spreading illness to new victims long after the original carriers had died or been sold. The impact of Viking trading practices on medieval commerce was significant, but largely negative. Other cultures began to associate Vikings not just with violence and raiding, but with disease and contamination. Some trading centers would refuse to do business with Vikings altogether, preferring to forfeit potential profits rather than risk exposure to Viking-borne illnesses. This reputation for contamination actually worked against Viking economic interests in the long run. While their military prowess allowed them to take what they wanted through force, their inability to maintain basic hygiene standards limited their ability to participate in peaceful trade networks. Vikings found themselves increasingly isolated from the commercial relationships that sustained other medieval cultures. The few non-Vikings who did business with these seafaring merchants developed elaborate precautions to minimize their exposure to contamination. Some would insist on conducting negotiations from a distance, using intermediaries to handle the actual exchange of goods. Others would fumigate their premises after Viking visits, burning herbs and incense in a futile attempt to cleanse the air of whatever diseases the Vikings had brought with them. But Vikings seemed oblivious to the negative impact their hygiene habits had on their commercial relationships. They attributed trade difficulties to the weakness and prejudice of other cultures, rather than examining their own practices. A Viking who was refused service at a trading post would blame foreign superstitions rather than considering that his personal stench might be driving away customers. This cultural blindness extended to their understanding of money and currency. Vikings would often carry coins and precious metals in the same pouches they used for storing food scraps, bodily waste, and various other organic matter. By the time these valuables reached the market, they were so contaminated that handling them required considerable courage or desperation on the part of potential trading partners. The concept of clean money was foreign to Viking culture. They saw no problem with currency that had been stored alongside rotting fish, human waste, or decomposing animal parts. The fact that other cultures found such contaminated money disgusting was just another sign of their weakness and lack of practical sense. Viking merchants would sometimes attempt to clean their goods before trading, but their methods were even more revolting than the original contamination. They would rinse items in whatever water was available, usually contaminated streams or stagnant ponds, then dry them using cloths that hadn't been washed in months. The result was goods that were technically cleaner, but actually more dangerous than before the cleaning attempt. The tools and weapons that Vikings traded were particularly problematic because they were often covered in blood, rust, and various organic matter from previous use. Viking smiths would forge new weapons using the same anvils and hammers they used to butcher animals, creating tools that were contaminated from the moment of creation. These weapons would then be stored in conditions that ensured maximum contamination before sale. Buyers of Viking weapons often found themselves dealing with items that were not just poorly maintained, but actively dangerous to handle. Swords and axes would be covered in a mixture of rust, blood, and organic matter that could cause infection through even minor cuts. Many warriors probably died not from battle wounds inflicted by Viking weapons, but from infections caused by simply handling the contaminated metal. The leather goods produced by Vikings were equally revolting, cured using methods that guaranteed contamination and treated with substances that would make modern tanners quit their profession. Viking leather workers would use urine, animal brains, and various rotting organic matter to process hides, creating products that were technically functional but biologically hazardous. These leather goods would retain their contamination indefinitely, slowly releasing toxic gases and harboring dangerous bacteria. Vikings would wear leather armor and clothing that was literally rotting on their bodies, apparently unbothered by the smell or the health risks. When they traded these items to other cultures, they were essentially selling biological weapons disguised as protective gear. The pottery and household goods produced by Viking craftsmen were contaminated from the moment of creation. Viking potters would work with clay that had been mixed with various organic matter, including human and animal waste, believing this improved the strength and durability of the finished products. The kilns used to fire these items were fueled by whatever combustible material was available, often including contaminated organic waste. The resulting pottery was functional but dangerous, harboring bacteria and toxins that would contaminate whatever food or drink was stored in them. Vikings would use these contaminated vessels for cooking, eating, and drinking, spreading disease throughout their communities with every meal. When they traded these items to other cultures, they were unknowingly exporting their unsanitary lifestyle along with their craftsmanship. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Viking commerce was their complete inability to understand why other cultures found their goods and practices so repulsive. Vikings had become so adapted to their contaminated lifestyle that they genuinely believed their methods were superior to the cleaner alternatives practiced by other civilizations. When foreign traders complained about the condition of Viking goods or refused to do business because of hygiene concerns, Vikings would interpret this as evidence of weakness or prejudice rather than reasonable health precautions. They saw their contaminated lifestyle as proof of their toughness and authenticity, while viewing cleaner cultures as soft and decadent. This cultural disconnect had profound implications for Viking society's long-term development. While other medieval cultures were gradually improving their sanitation and hygiene practices, Vikings remained stubbornly committed to methods that were not just ineffective, but actively harmful. Their isolation from cleaner trading networks meant they had fewer opportunities to observe and adopt better practices. The few Vikings who did travel extensively and observe other cultures' hygiene practices rarely brought these innovations back to their homeland. The social pressure to conform to traditional Viking standards was so intense that anyone who suggested adopting foreign cleaning methods would be ridiculed or ostracized. Innovation in hygiene was seen as cultural betrayal rather than practical improvement. This resistance to change extended to their treatment of foreign visitors and traders who came to Viking territories. Instead of learning from these outsiders' superior hygiene practices, Vikings would often force them to adopt Viking standards during their stay. Visitors would be expected to eat contaminated food, sleep in filthy accommodations, and participate in unsanitary communal activities. Many foreign merchants and diplomats would cut their visits short rather than endure the health risks associated with extended exposure to Viking lifestyle. This further isolated Viking society from the broader medieval world, limiting their opportunities for cultural and technological exchange. The very practices that Vikings believed made them superior were actually holding them back from advancement. The impact of Viking hygiene on their religious and spiritual practices was equally disturbing. Vikings believed that their gods favored warriors who embraced hardship and discomfort, interpreting their filthy lifestyle as evidence of spiritual strength. They would perform religious ceremonies in conditions that would horrify modern observers, believing that cleanliness was a sign of spiritual weakness. Viking temples and sacred sites were maintained using the same unsanitary methods that characterized all aspects of their culture. These religious spaces would be contaminated with human waste, rotting offerings, and the accumulated filth of countless worshippers. Vikings saw this contamination as evidence of authentic spiritual devotion rather than simple neglect. The priests and spiritual leaders of Viking society were often the filthiest members of their communities, wearing the same clothes for months and refusing to bathe as signs of their dedication to the gods. These religious figures would handle sacred objects with unwashed hands, contaminating religious artifacts and spreading disease during ceremonial activities. Viking religious festivals were particularly revolting affairs, combining the worst aspects of their hygiene practices with large gatherings of unwashed people. These events would feature communal feasting on contaminated food, drinking from shared vessels that had never been cleaned, and various ritualistic activities that spread disease throughout the assembled crowd. The dead were honored in ways that reflected Viking attitudes toward contamination and hygiene. Funeral ceremonies would often involve handling decomposing corpses with bare hands, eating meals in the presence of rotting bodies, and performing rituals that ensured maximum exposure to whatever diseases the deceased had carried. Viking burial practices were designed more to dispose of corpses quickly than to prevent the spread of disease. Bodies would be buried in shallow graves that contaminated groundwater or burned on funeral pyres that filled the air with toxic smoke. The ashes from these cremations would be scattered without regard for public health, often contaminating food and water sources. The few Vikings who questioned these practices or suggested improvements were usually silenced by social pressure or outright violence. Viking society had created a feedback loop where questioning traditional methods was seen as cowardice or foreign influence, ensuring that harmful practices would continue indefinitely. But perhaps most shocking of all was how Vikings treated their own children when it came to hygiene and health. Viking parents would deliberately expose their offspring to the most contaminated conditions possible, believing this would toughen them for adult life. Children who showed signs of being affected by poor sanitation were considered weak and unworthy of survival. Viking child-rearing practices were essentially Darwinian experiments in human adaptation, with parents using contamination and disease as tools to select for the strongest offspring. Children were fed contaminated food from birth, forced to sleep in filthy conditions, and denied medical treatment when they became ill. Those who survived were considered proven warriors. Those who died were dismissed as too weak for Viking life. The educational system, such as it existed, reinforced these attitudes by teaching children that cleanliness was associated with their enemies and that true Vikings should embrace filth as a sign of authenticity. Children would compete to see who could go longest without washing or who could consume the most contaminated food without becoming sick. These practices created a society where each generation was more adapted to contaminated conditions than the last, but also more isolated from the broader medieval world. Vikings were essentially evolving into a separate subspecies of humanity, one that could survive in conditions that would kill normal people, but that was increasingly unable to function in cleaner environments. The long-term consequences of Viking hygiene practices extended far beyond their own society. When Vikings settled in new territories, they brought their contaminated lifestyle with them, often causing disease outbreaks among local populations who lacked immunity to Viking-borne illnesses. Some historians believe that Viking expansion contributed to the spread of various diseases throughout medieval Europe. The genetic legacy of Viking hygiene is still visible today in Scandinavian populations. who show higher rates of certain genetic adaptations that may have evolved in response to chronic exposure to pathogens and toxins. These populations have immune systems that are notably different from other European groups, possibly reflecting centuries of adaptation to extremely unsanitary conditions. Modern archaeological investigations of Viking sites continue to reveal the extent of their contamination. Soil samples from Viking settlements show levels of organic contamination that would be considered hazardous waste by contemporary standards. These sites often require special handling and decontamination procedures even after centuries of natural breakdown. The study of Viking hygiene has become a specialized field within medieval archaeology, requiring researchers to take extensive safety precautions when handling artifacts and remains. Some Viking burial sites are so contaminated that they cannot be fully excavated without risking the health of the archaeological team. But perhaps the most important lesson from Viking hygiene practices is how cultural attitudes can override basic human survival instincts. Vikings created a society where practices that were obviously harmful were celebrated as virtues, where disease and suffering were seen as signs of strength, and where improvement was viewed as weakness. Their story serves as a warning about the power of cultural inertia and the danger of mistaking tradition for wisdom. Vikings were intelligent, capable people who achieved remarkable things in many areas of human endeavor. But when it came to basic hygiene, they were absolute disasters who turned cleanliness into a cultural taboo. The irony is that Vikings could have easily adopted better hygiene practices from the many cultures they encountered during their travels and raids. They had access to soap, clean water, and knowledge about sanitation from their interactions with cleaner civilizations. But they chose to reject these improvements in favor of their traditional methods, apparently preferring familiar filth to foreign cleanliness. This preference for familiar suffering over unfamiliar improvement may be one of the most human aspects of Viking culture. People often resist change even when that change would obviously benefit them, preferring the devil they know to the angel they don't. Vikings took this tendency to an extreme that cost them dearly in terms of health, longevity, and quality of life. Yet they persisted in their filthy ways for centuries, passing down their contaminated traditions with the same dedication they brought to their craftsmanship and exploration. They created a culture where being clean was literally unthinkable, where the very concept of hygiene was seen as foreign corruption that threatened their authentic way of life. And in doing so, they created one of history's most spectacular examples of how human beings can adapt to absolutely anything, no matter how revolting or harmful. Vikings proved that people can not only survive in conditions of extreme contamination, but can actually convince themselves that such conditions are desirable and superior to cleaner alternatives. Their legacy in terms of hygiene is a testament to human stubbornness, cultural blindness, and the amazing capacity for self-deception that allows people to celebrate their own suffering as virtue. Vikings didn't just live in filth. They turned filth into a religion, contamination into a cultural identity, and disease into a badge of honor. They were walking biological disasters who terrorized medieval Europe, not just with their weapons, but with their very presence. Yet they saw themselves as the pinnacle of human achievement, the only people tough enough to live authentically in a harsh world. It's a level of delusion that would be impressive if it weren't so absolutely, horrifyingly disgusting. The most shocking revelation about Viking hygiene isn't what we've already covered. It's what happened when these walking biological disasters encountered other cultures during their raids and conquests. You might think that exposure to cleaner civilizations would have inspired Vikings to improve their own practices. Instead, they did something far worse. They actively corrupted every clean environment they entered, turning pristine communities into replicas of their own fetid homeland. When Vikings raided monasteries, they didn't just steal treasure and burn buildings. They contaminated sacred spaces that had been maintained with meticulous care by monks who understood basic sanitation. These religious communities often had the cleanest living conditions in medieval Europe, with proper latrines, washing facilities, and rules about personal cleanliness. Vikings would destroy these systems not out of military necessity, but seemingly out of genuine revulsion at encountering such foreign concepts as soap and clean water. Archaeological evidence from raided monasteries shows a distinct pattern of contamination that coincides with Viking attacks. Sites that had maintained reasonable sanitation for centuries suddenly show layers of organic waste, contaminated water sources, and evidence of deliberate destruction of washing facilities. It's as if Vikings couldn't tolerate the existence of cleanliness and felt compelled to eliminate it wherever they found it. The monks who survived these raids left written accounts that are almost too disturbing to believe. They describe Vikings urinating in holy water fonts, defecating in food preparation areas, and using sacred vestments as toilet paper. But perhaps most shocking of all, they describe Vikings forcing the surviving monks to abandon their hygiene practices and adopt Viking standards of filthiness. Monks who had spent their lives maintaining clean bodies and souls were forced to roll in mud, forbidden from washing, and made to eat contaminated food as a form of spiritual humiliation. Some monks chose death rather than submit to such degradation, viewing the forced abandonment of cleanliness as a violation worse than physical torture. But Vikings didn't limit their contamination efforts to religious sites. When they conquered towns and cities, they would systematically destroy whatever sanitation infrastructure existed. Public baths, the few that existed in medieval Europe, were filled with waste or converted into stables. Wells were contaminated with human and animal remains. Streets that had been kept reasonably clean were turned into open sewers. The psychological impact of this deliberate contamination on conquered populations was devastating. Many cultures associated cleanliness with civilization, morality, and divine favor. By forcing people to live in filth, Vikings weren't just imposing physical discomfort. They were attacking the fundamental beliefs and values that held these societies together. Some historical accounts describe entire communities abandoning their homes rather than live under Viking sanitation standards. People would flee to forests and caves, preferring the uncertainty of wilderness life to the guaranteed contamination of Viking-occupied territories. This wasn't just about avoiding physical discomfort. It was about preserving their humanity in the face of what they saw as demonic corruption. The Vikings' treatment of captured women reveals another horrifying dimension of their hygiene practices. Women prisoners were not only subjected to physical and sexual violence, but were forced to abandon all personal care and cleanliness. Viking captors would deliberately contaminate female prisoners, covering them in waste and forcing them to live in conditions that violated every norm of feminine hygiene known to medieval culture. These women were then displayed as trophies, their degraded conditions serving as both entertainment for Vikings and psychological warfare against their home communities. The message was clear. This is what happens to your women when they fall into our hands. They become as filthy and degraded as we are, stripped not just of their freedom, but of their basic human dignity. Viking slave markets became showcases of human degradation, where cleanliness was actively punished and filthiness rewarded. Slaves who attempted to maintain any semblance of personal hygiene were beaten or tortured until they abandoned such efforts. The goal wasn't just to break their spirits, but to transform them into creatures as contaminated and revolting as their captors. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Viking contamination practices was how they treated children from conquered territories. Young captives were subjected to a systematic process of hygiene destruction, designed to eliminate any memory of cleaner living. Children who had grown up with basic sanitation were forced to unlearn these practices and adopt Viking standards of filthiness. This wasn't just neglect or indifference. It was active corruption, a deliberate effort to transform clean children into dirty Vikings. The process was so traumatic that many children died rather than complete the transformation. Those who survived emerged as hollow shells of their former selves, their personalities fundamentally altered by the experience of forced contamination. Viking foster families would take captured children and raise them according to Viking hygiene standards, believing they were improving the children by toughening them up. These adoptive parents would punish any attempt at cleanliness and reward increasingly filthy behavior. Children who had once known soap and clean water were trained to find such things disgusting and foreign. The long-term psychological effects of this forced contamination were profound. Many former captives who eventually escaped or were ransomed never fully recovered from their experience of Viking hygiene. They suffered from what we might now recognize as a form of post-traumatic stress disorder, specifically related to contamination and cleanliness. Some former captives became obsessively clean, spending hours each day washing and scrubbing in a futile attempt to remove the psychological stain of their Viking experience. Others went in the opposite direction, unable to tolerate cleanliness because it reminded them of their pre-captivity life and the trauma of having that life destroyed. But Vikings saw this psychological destruction as a positive outcome. They believed they were liberating people from the weakness and artificiality of clean living, showing them the authentic way to exist in harmony with the natural world. The fact that their victims were traumatized and broken was simply proof that the process was working. This attitude extended to their treatment of foreign diplomats and traders who came to Viking territories voluntarily. Instead of showing hospitality by providing clean accommodations and decent food, Vikings would deliberately subject visitors to their normal living conditions as a test of character and strength. Diplomatic missions to Viking territories often ended in failure, not because of political disagreements, but because the envoys couldn't physically tolerate the living conditions long enough to complete their negotiations. Some ambassadors would flee in the middle of the night rather than spend another day breathing the toxic air of a Viking longhouse. The few diplomats who managed to complete their missions often returned home with serious illnesses and psychological trauma. Their reports of Viking living conditions were so horrifying that many rulers refused to believe them, assuming the accounts were exaggerated for dramatic effect. The reality was actually worse than most people could imagine. Viking attitudes toward foreign visitors revealed a deep-seated belief that their way of life was not just preferable, but morally superior to cleaner alternatives. They genuinely believed they were doing visitors a favor by exposing them to authentic living conditions, free from the corrupting influence of soap and sanitation. When foreign visitors complained about the living conditions or became ill from exposure to Viking hygiene, Vikings interpreted this as evidence of weakness and decadence. A strong person, they reasoned, should be able to thrive in any environment. The fact that clean people couldn't adapt to filthy conditions proved that cleanliness was a form of weakness that left people vulnerable and dependent. This circular logic allowed Vikings to maintain their belief in the superiority of their hygiene practices, despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary. Every sick visitor, every failed diplomatic mission, every community that fled rather than submit to Viking sanitation standards was simply more proof that Vikings were tougher and more authentic than everyone else. The impact of Viking hygiene on international relations in medieval Europe was significant, but rarely discussed in historical accounts. Many potential alliances were never formed because rulers couldn't bring themselves to deal directly with Viking representatives. Trade relationships that might have benefited both sides never developed because merchants couldn't tolerate the physical reality of doing business with Vikings. Some kingdoms developed elaborate protocols for dealing with Viking envoys that involved conducting all negotiations outdoors, providing separate accommodations that were burned after use, and requiring extensive purification rituals for anyone who came into direct contact with Viking representatives. These weren't religious ceremonies, but practical health measures designed to prevent the spread of Viking-borne diseases. The few successful diplomatic relationships between Vikings and cleaner cultures were usually conducted through intermediaries who were either immune to Viking contamination or willing to sacrifice their health for political gain. These go-betweens often died young from diseases contracted during their service, but they were considered heroes for their willingness to bridge the gap between civilized and barbarian worlds. Viking inability to understand or respect other cultures' hygiene standards also limited their effectiveness as conquerors and occupiers. While they could seize territory through military force, they struggled to govern conquered populations who would rather rebel than live under Viking sanitation standards. Many Viking conquests were short-lived because the local population would flee rather than adapt to Viking living conditions. The economic costs of Viking hygiene were equally significant. Territories under Viking control often experienced population decline, agricultural failure, and commercial collapse as people abandoned contaminated areas. The Vikings would then blame these problems on the weakness of the local population rather than examining their own role in creating uninhabitable conditions. But perhaps the most tragic aspect of Viking contamination practices was how they affected children born in Viking-occupied territories. These children grew up in environments that were contaminated beyond anything their parents had experienced, creating a generation that was even more adapted to filth than their Viking overlords. These hybrid populations developed immune systems that were specifically adapted to Viking-level contamination, making them unable to function in cleaner environments. They became prisoners of their own biology, trapped in a lifestyle that was slowly killing them, but that they could no longer escape without dying even faster. The genetic legacy of Viking contamination practices can still be detected in some European populations today. Certain genetic markers associated with pathogen resistance are more common in areas that experienced prolonged Viking occupation, suggesting that natural selection favored individuals who could survive extreme contamination. But this adaptation came at a terrible cost. Populations that evolved to survive Viking hygiene standards often suffered from higher rates of chronic illness, shorter lifespans, and various genetic disorders that may have been linked to centuries of exposure to extreme contamination. The biological price of adapting to Viking lifestyle was paid by countless generations of descendants. Modern medical research has revealed that some autoimmune disorders and genetic diseases are more common in populations with Viking ancestry, possibly reflecting the long-term consequences of evolutionary adaptation to extreme pathogen exposure. These people's ancestors survived Viking contamination, but their descendants continue to pay the price in the form of genetic health problems. The psychological legacy of Viking hygiene practices is equally disturbing. Cultural attitudes toward cleanliness and contamination in some Scandinavian communities reflect centuries of conditioning that associated filthiness with authenticity and strength. Even today, some traditional practices in these regions prioritize toughness over hygiene in ways that can be traced back to Viking influence. Archaeological investigations of Viking settlements continue to reveal new horrors about their hygiene practices. Recent excavations have uncovered evidence of contamination so severe that some sites require hazardous material protocols to investigate safely. The soil at these locations is still toxic after more than 1,000 years, contaminated with heavy metals, organic pollutants, and various other substances that Vikings used in their daily lives. Some Viking burial sites contain remains that are so contaminated they cannot be studied using normal archaeological methods. The bodies themselves have become toxic waste, preserved not by careful preparation, but by the sheer level of contamination in their tissues. These remains provide a horrifying glimpse into what Viking bodies look like after a lifetime of exposure to their hygiene practices. The tools and artifacts recovered from Viking sites often require special handling because they remain contaminated with dangerous substances. Viking weapons contain traces of blood, rust, and organic matter that can still cause infections in researchers who handle them carelessly. Viking pottery and household items harbor bacteria and toxins that remain active after centuries in the ground. But perhaps most disturbing of all are the human remains found in Viking settlements. These skeletons show evidence of diseases, infections, and parasitic infestations that were so severe they literally changed the shape and structure of the bones. Viking skulls often show signs of chronic sinus infections so severe they ate away portions of the facial bones. Viking spines are frequently deformed by infections that spread from contaminated clothing and bedding. The teeth found in Viking remains are among the most horrifying examples of dental neglect in the archaeological record. Many Viking skulls contain no teeth at all, the bones having resorbed after all the teeth fell out from decay and infection. Those skulls that do contain teeth often show evidence of abscesses so severe they probably caused excruciating pain and may have contributed to the Vikings' legendary aggression. Viking finger bones frequently show signs of chronic infections caused by their habit of handling contaminated materials with bare hands. Many Viking skeletons are missing finger bones entirely, lost to gangrene and amputation. The few complete Viking hands that have been discovered show evidence of constant infection and injury from their unsanitary lifestyle. But it's the internal organs of preserved Viking remains that provide the most shocking evidence of their hygiene practices. Viking mummies and bog bodies contain stomach contents that read like a catalog of contamination. Their last meals often included materials that would be classified as hazardous waste by modern standards: rotting meat, contaminated grains, and various organic matter that had no business being consumed by human beings. The intestinal contents of Viking remains show evidence of massive parasitic infestations that would have caused constant pain, malnutrition, and digestive problems. Some Viking mummies contain parasites that are extinct in the modern world, preserved only in the guts of people who died over 1,000 years ago. These parasites were so well adapted to Viking hygiene conditions that they couldn't survive in cleaner environments. Viking liver and kidney remains show evidence of chronic poisoning from the various toxic substances they consumed as part of their daily diet. These organs are often enlarged and diseased, indicating that Vikings suffered from constant low-level poisoning throughout their lives. The cumulative effects of this poisoning probably contributed to their short lifespans and erratic behavior. The respiratory systems of Viking remains reveal the effects of breathing contaminated air for entire lifetimes. Viking lungs are often blackened and scarred from inhaling smoke, dust, and various airborne contaminants. Many show signs of chronic infections that would have made breathing difficult and painful, but perhaps most horrifying of all are the brain tissues that have been preserved in some Viking remains. These show evidence of infections, parasites, and toxic exposure that would have affected cognitive function and mental stability. Some Viking brains contain cysts and lesions that indicate chronic infection, possibly explaining the erratic and violent behavior that characterized Viking culture. The few Viking hearts that have been preserved show evidence of chronic stress and disease caused by their lifestyle. These organs are often enlarged and damaged, indicating that Vikings suffered from cardiovascular problems that were probably related to their contaminated diet and living conditions. Modern forensic analysis of Viking remains has revealed that many Vikings died not from battle wounds or accidents, but from preventable diseases caused by their hygiene practices. The leading causes of death in Viking communities were infections, poisoning, and parasitic diseases that could have been easily prevented with basic sanitation. The average lifespan of Vikings was significantly shorter than that of their contemporaries in cleaner cultures, despite their reputation for physical toughness. Most Vikings died before reaching the age of 40, and many didn't survive childhood. The few who lived to old age were walking medical disasters, their bodies ravaged by decades of exposure to contamination. Yet Vikings continued to believe that their hygiene practices were superior to cleaner alternatives right up until their culture finally collapsed. They attributed their high mortality rates to the will of the gods, rather than examining their own role in creating the conditions that killed them. Even when faced with overwhelming evidence that cleaner cultures lived longer and healthier lives, Vikings refused to change their ways. This stubborn adherence to harmful practices in the face of contradictory evidence may be the most human aspect of Viking culture. People often resist change even when that change would obviously benefit them, preferring familiar suffering to unfamiliar improvement. Vikings took this tendency to an extreme that cost them everything, but they never wavered in their conviction that they were living the only authentic and honorable way possible. The story of Viking hygiene is ultimately a story about the power of culture to override basic survival instincts. Vikings created a society where practices that were obviously harmful were celebrated as virtues, where disease and suffering were seen as signs of strength, and where improvement was viewed as corruption. They turned contamination into a religion and filth into a badge of honor. Their legacy serves as a warning about the dangers of cultural extremism and the importance of remaining open to change and improvement. Vikings were intelligent, capable people who achieved remarkable things in many areas of human endeavor. But when it came to basic hygiene, they were absolute disasters who chose tradition over health, authenticity over survival, and pride over practical wisdom. They proved that human beings can adapt to absolutely anything, no matter how revolting or harmful, and can even convince themselves that such conditions are desirable and superior to alternatives. But they also proved that adaptation without wisdom is ultimately self-destructive, leading to unnecessary suffering and premature death. The Vikings may have terrorized medieval Europe with their raids and conquests, but their greatest victims were themselves and their own children, condemned to lives of disease, suffering, and early death by cultural practices that prioritize toughness over health and tradition over improvement. They were walking biological disasters who turned hygiene into heresy and cleanliness into cultural treason. And perhaps most tragically of all, they seemed genuinely happy with their revolting lifestyle, convinced that they were the only people tough enough to live authentically in a harsh world. It's a level of self-deception that would be admirable if it weren't so absolutely, horrifyingly, and completely disgusting. In the end, as we close this chapter on the most nauseating civilization in human history, it's worth remembering that the Vikings weren't just dirty by accident or circumstance. They were dirty by design, by choice, and by deeply held cultural conviction. They had encountered cleaner civilizations during their travels and raids. They had access to soap, clean water, and basic sanitation knowledge from the Romans, the Byzantines, and countless other cultures they terrorized. But they rejected it all in favor of their traditional filth, apparently believing that contamination was a sign of spiritual strength and authentic living. The most disturbing aspect of Viking hygiene wasn't their ignorance. It was their willful embrace of practices they knew were harmful. They turned disease into a virtue, suffering into a badge of honor, and early death into evidence of divine favor. They created a culture so toxic that it literally poisoned everyone who came into contact with it, including their own children. And yet, for all their revolting habits, the Vikings left an indelible mark on history. They explored unknown oceans, established trade routes that connected distant continents, and created art and literature that still inspires us today. Their ships were marvels of engineering, their metalwork was exquisite, and their poetry was surprisingly sophisticated. They were capable of remarkable achievements in almost every area of human endeavor except the most basic one, keeping themselves clean. This contradiction reveals something profound about human nature. Intelligence, creativity, and technical skill don't automatically translate into wisdom about health and survival. People can be brilliant in some areas while being absolute disasters in others. The Vikings proved that a culture can master complex navigation, advanced metallurgy, and intricate storytelling while simultaneously believing that washing yourself makes you weak. Their story serves as a cautionary tale about the power of cultural tradition to override common sense and basic survival instincts. Vikings weren't stupid people. They were people who had been conditioned by their culture to believe that obviously harmful practices were actually beneficial. They lived in a society where questioning traditional methods was seen as cowardice or foreign corruption, ensuring that destructive habits would persist for generations. The psychological damage caused by Viking hygiene practices extended far beyond their own communities. The children they captured, the slaves they traded, and the populations they conquered all suffered lasting trauma from exposure to Viking sanitation standards. Many never recovered from the experience of being forced to abandon basic human cleanliness and live like animals. But perhaps the most tragic victims were the Viking children themselves, born into a world where contamination was normal and cleanliness was forbidden. These children never had a choice about their lifestyle. They were condemned from birth to lives of disease, suffering, and early death. By cultural practices, they had no power to change. Many died in infancy from preventable diseases. Those who survived grew up believing that their constant suffering was normal and necessary. The genetic legacy of Viking hygiene practices continues to affect Scandinavian populations today. Centuries of evolutionary pressure have left their mark in the form of genetic adaptations to extreme pathogen exposure. While these adaptations helped some Vikings survive their toxic environment, they also created long-term health problems that persist in modern populations. Archaeological evidence suggests that Viking settlements were so contaminated they remained uninhabitable for decades after abandonment. The soil itself became toxic from centuries of accumulated waste, rotting organic matter, and various pollutants that Vikings introduced into their environment. Some former Viking sites are still contaminated today, over 1,000 years later. The study of Viking hygiene has become a specialized field, requiring extensive safety precautions and hazardous material protocols. Researchers working with Viking remains must wear protective equipment and follow decontamination procedures that would be more appropriate for handling radioactive waste than medieval artifacts. The very people we study continue to pose health risks even after a millennium in the ground. Yet for all their failures in personal hygiene, the Vikings succeeded in creating one of the most memorable and influential cultures in human history. Their reputation for ferocity and toughness was partly deserved, even if it came at the cost of their health and longevity. They were genuinely hardy people who could survive in conditions that would kill most modern humans within days. Their ability to endure extreme contamination and disease while still functioning as warriors, explorers, and craftsmen is actually quite remarkable from a purely biological perspective. Vikings represented an extreme example of human adaptability, proving that our species can survive almost anything if the selective pressure is strong enough and the cultural conditioning is complete enough. But survival isn't the same as thriving, and adaptation isn't always progress. Vikings survived their toxic lifestyle, but they paid a terrible price for that survival. They lived shorter, more painful lives than they needed to. They watched their children die from preventable diseases. They suffered from chronic illnesses that could have been easily avoided with basic sanitation. Their story reminds us that just because humans can adapt to extreme conditions doesn't mean they should. Some traditions are worth abandoning, some practices deserve to be forgotten, and some cultural values need to be questioned rather than blindly followed. The Vikings' stubborn adherence to harmful hygiene practices ultimately contributed to the decline of their civilization. As their world changed and they came into increasing contact with cleaner cultures, Vikings found themselves at a disadvantage. Their reputation for contamination made them unwelcome trading partners. Their high mortality rates weakened their military effectiveness. Their inability to adapt to changing standards of cleanliness isolated them from the broader medieval world. In the end, Viking culture was defeated not by superior armies or better weapons, but by its own internal contradictions and stubborn resistance to improvement. They were conquered by Christianity, partly because Christian communities offered cleaner, healthier alternatives to traditional Viking lifestyle. People chose conversion not just for spiritual reasons, but for practical ones. Christianity meant soap, sanitation, and a chance to live past 40. The transformation of Scandinavian culture from Viking contamination to relative cleanliness took centuries and required the complete abandonment of traditional hygiene practices. It was one of the most dramatic cultural changes in European history, involving the rejection of deeply held beliefs about authenticity, toughness, and the relationship between humans and nature. Today, Scandinavian countries are among the cleanest and most hygienic in the world, representing a complete reversal of their Viking heritage. Modern Scandinavians would be horrified by their ancestors' hygiene practices, just as their Viking ancestors would probably be disgusted by modern cleanliness standards. Culture is powerful enough to make the same genetic population embrace completely opposite values within a few generations. The Viking story teaches us that cultural evolution doesn't always move in a positive direction. Sometimes societies develop practices that are harmful and self-destructive, and sometimes these practices become so entrenched that they resist change even when the costs become obvious. Progress isn't inevitable, and wisdom isn't guaranteed. But their story also demonstrates the incredible resilience of the human spirit. Even in the most revolting and toxic conditions imaginable, Vikings found ways to create beauty, meaning, and connection. They told stories, made art, formed bonds, and found joy despite living in what can only be described as biological hell. Their capacity for happiness and creativity in the face of such appalling conditions is actually quite inspiring. The Vikings may have had the worst hygiene in human history, but they also had some of the most indomitable spirits. They faced every challenge with stubborn determination, whether that challenge was crossing unknown oceans, fighting superior armies, or simply surviving another day in their toxic homeland. Their refusal to give up, even when their own practices were killing them, reveals a kind of courage that's both admirable and tragic. So as we drift off to sleep tonight, clean and comfortable in our modern beds, let's remember the Vikings not just as cautionary tales about the importance of hygiene, but as reminders of human resilience in the face of impossible odds. They lived in conditions that would break most of us, yet they found ways to thrive, to create, and to leave their mark on history. Their legacy is complex and contradictory, filled with both horror and heroism, contamination and creativity, suffering and strength. They were walking biological disasters who somehow managed to change the world, proving that even the most flawed humans can achieve greatness, even if that greatness comes at a terrible price. The next time you complain about your shower being too cold or your soap running out, remember the Vikings who lived and died without either, convinced that their way was the only authentic path through this harsh and unforgiving world. They were wrong about hygiene, but they were right about one thing. Life is hard, survival is precious, and sometimes the most human response to impossible conditions is simply to keep going, no matter how revolting the circumstances become. And with that thought, as the gentle hum of your fan carries you toward cleaner dreams, let the Vikings finally rest in their contaminated peace, their story told, their legacy preserved, their hygiene habits safely buried in the past where they belong. Sleep well, and remember, sometimes the best thing about history is that we no longer have to live it.